On October 23, 1944, in the thick forests near the German border, veteran German soldiers waited for what they assumed would be another easy fight. They had heard the Americans were bringing in a fresh division, the 104th Infantry, the Timberwolves. To the Germans that meant inexperienced farm boys who would crumble under pressure. They had broken green American units before and expected nothing different this time. What they didn't know was that this division was led by a man they would soon come to fear. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. His own army called him Terrible Terry, a commander dismissed once for being too aggressive, too unconventional, and too uncontrollable for peacetime generals to stomach. But to German soldiers who faced him, he became a name passed quietly from trench to trench, a warning that the Americans would not be fighting by daylight alone. Allen's rise to this point began long before the Timberwolves ever saw Europe. Born in 1888 at Fort Douglas, Utah, he grew up steeped in army life. His father had served for decades and his grandfather had fought and bled at Gettysburg. Allen learned to ride, shoot, and live the life of a frontier soldier almost from infancy. Military service wasn't a choice for him, it was heritage. When he earned an appointment to West Point, it looked like the perfect continuation of his family's legacy. But Allen was restless, impatient, and uninterested in the rigid academic world the academy demanded. He struggled with mathematics, stuttered in recitations, earned piles of demerits, and failed key courses. By 1911 he was dismissed. For most men, that was the end of any hope of an army career. Allen simply changed direction. He enrolled at Catholic University, finished a degree, and secured a commission anyway. Proof that he was willing to force open doors that tradition said were closed. His early career showed the same pattern. In 1913, instead of waiting for reinforcements as doctrine demanded, he led 6 men against 30 armed rustlers on the Mexican border and beat them through sheer audacity. When he reached France in World War I, he finally got the combat he wanted. Assigned to command a battalion in the 90th Division, he discovered an insight that would shape everything that followed. Night attacks produced fewer casualties than daylight assaults. Under darkness, defenders were blind, artillery was ineffective, and fear worked for the attackers instead of against them. Allen built a system around this idea: simple plans, clear objectives, and rehearsed movements that turned confusion into advantage. In October 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he was shot in the face by machine gun fire but refused evacuation, returning to lead his battalion until the fight was over. His men never forgot it. His superiors didn't either. He earned the Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts before the war ended. But the years that followed were bleak. The army shrank, promotions halted, and many officers drifted into irrelevance. Allen stayed active, competing in brutal cavalry events, even earning an Olympic bronze in polo. He studied modern warfare relentlessly and waited for the next battle. By 1940, war was clearly coming again. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall had a rare talent for identifying leaders who could fight, and he saw something in Terry Allen that others overlooked. Allen was promoted directly from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping an entire rank. 2 years later, Marshall placed him at the head of the 1st Infantry Division, the powerful and historic Big Red one. It was a gamble on a man who broke rules and upset traditionalists, but Marshall believed he could win battles, and that was all that mattered. Allen's true test came in World War II. When the United States finally entered the fight, he took command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, and led them into the North African campaign. Their first major combat came during Operation Torch in November 1942, the first American offensive on the European front. The landings were chaotic and costly, but Allen's men secured their objectives. They were in the war for real, and under Allen, they were about to learn how to fight like veterans. North Africa quickly became a harsh proving ground. The Germans under Rommel were seasoned desert fighters with years of battlefield experience. Many American units were green, poorly coordinated, and slow to react. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, several U.S. units collapsed under German pressure, retreating in confusion. It was one of the first major American defeats of the war. But Allen was one of the few commanders who steadied the line. At Jebel el Hamra, he organized a counterattack, directed artillery under fire, and captured hundreds of enemy troops. His actions prevented a complete disaster. The next true turning point came at El Ghetar in March 1943. German armor repeatedly attacked American positions for 3 weeks. The heat was brutal. Ammunition ran low. Allen's headquarters was nearly overrun when the German tanks pushed through the front. When urged to pull back to safety, Allen refused. If the headquarters retreated, he knew younger troops might lose heart. He stood outside, calmly watching the tanks approach, and told his officers he'd shoot the first man who tried to pull out. His determination helped steady the entire division. American guns finally broke the attack, marking the first time U.S. forces defeated veteran German armor in open battle. The Big Red One became one of the most respected American formations in the theater, pushing relentlessly across Tunisia toward Tunis. By May, the Axis position collapsed, and 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. The North African campaign was over. Then came Sicily. On July 10, 1943, Allen's division landed on the beaches at Gela, the most exposed landing zone of the invasion. Patton had specifically wanted Allen's division there because he trusted their toughness. The next day, German tanks launched a fierce counterattack, threatening to drive into the sea. Naval gunfire, along with Allen's infantry, held the line in desperate fighting. Omar Bradley later said, "Almost no other American division could have stopped that attack." The battle for Sicily turned into a brutal campaign across mountains and fortified towns. At Troina, Allen's division fought 6 straight days of grinding combat, repelling 24 German counterattacks, house by house and ridge by ridge. It was one of the most punishing fights in Sicily, but the Big Red One never gave ground. The town finally fell, opening the way to Messina. The cost, however, was high. After nearly a year of constant combat, the division was exhausted, but just as Allen's success reached its peak, he was removed from command. Time magazine had just put him on the cover, calling him a brilliant rising general. Yet 2 days before the issue hit newsstands, Bradley relieved him. The reasons were complicated. Bradley and Eisenhower felt Allen's troops were fighting well but didn't always maintain proper discipline behind the lines. Others believed Allen was simply too unorthodox, too rough, and too independent for the long-term structure of the army. Despite the rumors, Eisenhower himself stated Allen was not relieved for incompetence. In fact, Bradley admitted in his memoirs that no one exceeded Terry Allen in battlefield leadership. But Allen was a wartime commander in a peacetime system, and the High Command wanted someone more conventional. Allen returned to the United States, publicly disgraced and reduced back to brigadier general. Most officers would have faded into an early retirement. Allen asked for another division. He received it, the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, almost entirely made up of untested young men. Where others saw a mediocre assignment, Allen saw a chance to rebuild and prove himself again. He trained his new division harder than any in the army. While other units trained about a dozen hours per week, Allen pushed his men through 30 or more. They marched for hours in darkness, rehearsed night infiltration, and practiced attacks without light or radios. He taught them to navigate by compass, move silently, and strike before the enemy understood what was happening. By the time they sailed for Europe in 1944, the 104th was the only American division specifically trained for night combat. Bradley later admitted Allen brought the only unit in the European theater truly prepared for fighting in darkness, and the Germans were about to learn it the hard way. The Timberwolves entered combat on October 23, 1944, near the German border. Veteran German troops, certain they were facing inexperienced Americans, waited confidently in the darkness. They expected another easy defensive fight. But the moment Allen unleashed his division, the Germans realized they were facing something entirely different. The first attacks came silently in the night. American companies moved through the forests without flashlights or noise, guided only by compass and memory. They hit German positions from directions no one anticipated. Sentries were taken down quietly before alarms could be raised. Trenches and bunkers were overrun in minutes. Enemy machine gun crews fired blindly into the dark. By dawn, the German lines were shaken. Reports came down from every sector, These Americans were trained night fighters, aggressive, unpredictable, and fast. This became a pattern. On November 2nd, the 104th crossed the Mark River in a night operation that caught German defenders completely off guard. In mid-November, they entered the industrial Aachen sector, a fortified region that had resisted multiple Allied divisions for weeks. Allen's night tactics broke defenses that daylight assaults failed to crack. German units described being attacked by troops who seemed to appear from nowhere. When the Germans launched their massive Ardennes offensive in December, the Battle of the Bulge, the Timberwolves held critical defensive positions from December 15 into late February. They absorbed repeated attacks, anchored the line, and prevented a wider breakthrough. Despite freezing weather and fierce German pressure, the division held firm. On February 23, 1945, they crossed the Roer River under fire and pushed deeper into Germany. From that point forward, the Germans were constantly pressured in the dark, forced to stay alert for attacks that could come at any hour. Captured German reports described the 104th as an elite unit specializing in night combat. Even Axis Sally, the German propaganda broadcaster, complained that the Americans' night fighting tactics were unfair, proof that the division had become an enemy nightmare. By March, Allen's men were advancing quickly. They captured Cologne on March 5, then crossed the Rhine River on March 22, a major milestone in the collapse of Nazi Germany. Their momentum didn't slow. They advanced 193 miles in 9 days, then another 175 miles in the next 2 weeks. Their rapid pace overwhelmed German defenses and disrupted retreating forces across central Germany. Then, in early April, the division encountered a tragedy that left a permanent mark: the Nordhausen concentration camp. What they found was horrifying. Thousands of bodies left unburied, prisoners starved and dying, underground tunnels filled with evidence of slave labor and mass death. Even battle-hardened soldiers were sickened. Allen ordered every detail documented and forced local German civilians to see what their government had done. He wanted witnesses. He wanted truth. He wanted proof no one could deny. A few days later came the battle for Halle, a major city defended by determined German forces. The fighting was house to house and room to room. Civilians were trapped between the lines, and the city risked destruction. Then an unexpected figure emerged. Count Felix von Luckner, a legendary German naval officer from World War I, now an elderly civilian trying to save his hometown. He negotiated with Allen under a white flag, helping arrange partial surrenders that reduced casualties and prevented the destruction of the city. Allen, recognizing honorable courage when he saw it, later named von Luckner an honorary colonel of the division. Finally, on April 26, the Timberwolves made contact with Soviet forces at the Elbe River, a symbolic moment marking the effective collapse of Hitler's Germany. The war in Europe would end soon. By then, the 104th had been in continuous combat for 200 days. They had not failed a single major mission. They had never been pushed back. They had earned the respect of Allied commanders and the fear of German veterans. Bradley, who had once fired Allen, visited him after the capture of Cologne. Impressed by the division's performance, he told Allen that the Timberwolves now ranked alongside the 1st and 9th Divisions, the elite of the entire U.S. Army. Allen's answer was simple and proud. The 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company. The man who had been dismissed from his 1st Division now commanded another that stood among the best on the continent. The methods that got him fired had forged another elite fighting force. He had proved, again, that his way worked. When the war ended, Terry Allen had accomplished something few American generals ever achieved. He had taken 2 completely different divisions, one a historic battle-scarred unit and the other a group of untested kids, and turned both into fearsome fighting forces. The 1st Infantry Division had become the spearhead of the North African and Sicilian campaigns. The 104th Infantry Division had become the Allies' premier night fighting formation, undefeated in every major operation across northwest Europe. No matter where Allen went, his soldiers fought harder, learned faster, and adapted quicker than anyone expected. His legacy wasn't built on luck or circumstance. It was built on training, innovation, and a bond with his men that few commanders ever forged. Allen retired from the army in 1946 as a major general. He had wanted a third star, but it never came. The same traits that made him deadly in war, his bluntness, his unconventional style, his disregard for polished military formality, made the peacetime army uneasy. He drank more than they liked. He swore too freely. He ignored protocol if it got in the way of combat readiness. But the men who served under him never forgot what he gave them: leadership that felt personal, direct, and fearless. Ernie Pyle wrote that Allen was one of the few generals he could call by first name, a man who lived for combat and breathed confidence into the men he led. In the field, no one doubted what Allen could do. After the war, Allen moved to El Paso, Texas, near Fort Bliss, where he lived quietly. But the peace he hoped for didn't last. On October 17, 1967, tragedy struck. His son, Lieutenant Colonel Terry de la Mesa Allen, Jr., was killed in Vietnam. He had been commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment his father had led in World War I. The battalion walked into a massive Viet Cong ambush, and Allen Jr., despite being wounded, kept moving toward the front to rally his men. He was killed there, leading from the front as his father had always done. For his actions he received the Distinguished Service Cross. The death destroyed Terry Allen. He had survived 2 world wars, 2 divisions, countless battles, but losing his son was a wound he could not overcome. His health collapsed. Strokes and heart problems followed. The fire that had carried him through decades of combat was gone. Almost 2 years later, on September 12, 1969, Terry Allen died at age 81. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery beside his son, a father and son united in service, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of war. Today, the legacy of Terry Allen lives on in ways few could have predicted. West Point, the very institution that dismissed him as a failed cadet, now honors his name with an award given to the top cadet in military science. The irony is profound. The academy that once saw him as unfit for their system now celebrates him as an example for future officers. His career proved that battlefield excellence does not always fit neatly into institutional expectations. He was rough, flawed, and unconventional, but on the battlefield he was extraordinary. German soldiers who fought him in North Africa, Sicily, and Europe came to the same conclusion. They learned that whenever Allen's divisions appeared, the fighting would be harder, the attacks faster, and the nights more dangerous. They spread warnings about his night fighters, about a commander who never let up and whose troops never backed down. In every campaign, Allen proved that with training, confidence, and the right leadership, American soldiers could defeat some of the most experienced troops in the world. The story of Terry Allen is not about a perfect general. It is about a relentless one. A man fired at the height of his success, only to rebuild his reputation by forging yet another exceptional division. A commander who inspired loyalty because he fought alongside his men, taught them how to survive, and pushed them to be better than they believed possible. 2 divisions entered combat under him. 2 divisions emerged as elite. Terrible, Terry Allen never became a household name like Patton or Eisenhower, but among soldiers, American and German alike, his name meant something far more important: a leader who made ordinary men fight like veterans, and veterans fight like winners. By the time the war was over, Terry Allen had carved out a place in military history that few commanders ever reach, even if the public only dimly remembers his name. His brilliance wasn't in commanding vast armies or drafting grand strategy. It was in taking ordinary Americans, farm boys, factory hands, students, clerks, and turning them into tough, disciplined fighters who did not break under pressure. The 1st Infantry Division and the 104th Infantry Division were shaped in his image: aggressive, confident, reliable, and unshakable in combat. German troops who fought these divisions learned to recognize the signs. When the big red one entered a sector, resistance stiffened. When the Timberwolves appeared, night became a threat instead of a refuge. German intelligence officers eventually documented patterns. The Americans under Allen moved faster, struck harder, and used the darkness with terrifying efficiency. They were not typical infantry. They were Allen's soldiers. The reason his men fought the way they did was simple. Allen trained them harder than anyone else. He cared about results, not appearances. He didn't obsess over polished boots or perfect formations. He cared about survival. He cared about winning. His soldiers loved him for it because they could see that everything he demanded was tied to combat effectiveness, not vanity or ego. They trusted him because he never asked them to take risks he wasn't willing to take himself. This trust is what kept his units cohesive under the worst conditions. It's what steadied lines at El Getar, held beaches at Gela, cracked German defenses in Aachen, and drove through Germany in the final months of the war. Soldiers followed him because he had earned the right to lead them. But Allen's legacy isn't just battlefield victories. It's what his life says about the military itself. He represented the reality that some of the most effective combat leaders don't fit neatly into institutional molds. He wasn't polished. He wasn't politically cautious. He wasn't obsessed with rules, uniforms, or ceremony. He was obsessed with defeating the enemy and keeping his men alive. And in wartime, that made him invaluable. Yet the very traits that made him essential during war became liabilities afterward. His candor, his aggression, his unconventional methods, they made the peacetime army uneasy. But history tends to remember results, and Allen's results speak for themselves. 2 divisions, 2 theaters, 2 undefeated combat records under his command. The tragedy of losing his son in Vietnam added a painful full circle to his story. The Allen family had given generations of military service, and the war took its final toll on him through the death of Terry Allen Jr. The image of the father and son buried side by side at Fort Bliss tells the story better than any biography could. The price of service, paid across decades in 2 different wars, by 2 different men shaped by the same warrior spirit. Today, when cadets at West Point receive the Terry de la Mesa Allen Award for excellence in military science, most of them don't know the deeper irony behind the honor. They don't know that the award's namesake once failed out of their academy, dismissed for academic struggles and a restless temperament. They don't know that he returned decades later, not as a student, but as a legend, an example of the truth that battlefield leadership is often forged in places no academic system can measure. German veterans who fought him